But I want to play us a clip about the protest that happened at Te Papa today, and I want to get your thoughts about it. So let's just go to One News and have a bit of a look at this story to start with. For people who don't know, well, let's just let Simon Della tell it what it's all about.
Police have arrested 12 protesters involved with defacing the English version of the Treaty of Waitangi exhibit at Te Papa. Abseiling equipment, spray paint and a power tool were used to vandalise the wooden panel. The protest groups say the translation displayed at our National Museum is misleading. Kushla Norman reports.
Dressed like tradies and high-vis, about a dozen protesters walked into Te Papa at about midday. Their target, a wooden panel of the English version of the Treaty of Waitangi. They painted over the third article, a removal of what they say is a translation that misleads and perpetuates a dangerous lie.
99% of the people who go through Te Papa are going to not be able to understand the Te Reo Māori version, Te Treaty of Waitangi, the only legal document, and so they're going to read the English artefact, which can be read that sovereignty was ceded, which is absolutely not true.
Te Papa's had protests before, but today's shocked staff.
It's a real balance, Protest is essential in New Zealand. Museums are a site where we come together to have the really important conversations. Being able to support that is really, really important to us. Damaging things inside of the museum is a step too far.
It's quite a balanced response from Te Papa themselves, kind of going, look, protest is fine, but yeah, the thing that stuck out to me, and I've been watching the Stop Oil protesters in the UK and various groups throwing paint at paintings and that kind of stuff. None of that is kind of permanent damage. Like even the world's most expensive paintings, they're behind plastic for their own protection, whereas a grinder on this thing is permanent damage. And I guess that's what the person from Te Papa was saying. There's a real balance between getting your views out and I guess costing the museum, who knows, tens of thousands of dollars to get something fixed or taken down or whatever. But the reason I'm playing the One News one, and we'll keep watching it, Byron, is there's a really interesting bit where someone comes along and talks more to the idea of how insidious it could be to have the English version out there, kind of like what the protesters are saying, but I guess many people are questioning the extent to which they took their protest. But we'll talk about that when we're wrapping it up. Let's go for a bit more on this news item.
The Te Reo and English versions have been displayed facing each other as part of a permanent exhibition since the museum opened in 1998. Panels between them highlight the differences in interpretation. Those involved in today's protests have been calling for Te Papa to take the English artefact down since 2021.
We are by far from the first people to be requesting this. In the very conception of Te Papa, they had a Māori advisory board, and we know from members of that board that the views of Māori were silenced. That's a quote.
Te Papa says it sought advice.
Look, the way that we develop exhibitions and experience and research, we actively involve and work with our communities and peoples on anything that we do. So it's that's an evolving nature. And look, we welcome the feedback and to make sure that we actually can have the best experience possible.
This treaty law academic says the museum needs to rethink its display of the treaty.
I think we're now at a point where it is misleading to simply say, well, there's an English text and a Māori text and they're equivalent, or that they are of equivalent value or relevance or importance. So I think it is maybe a point where we ought to be reevaluating the way in which Te Papa is presenting that.
Police have arrested.
So that's pretty much the story. We can leave it there. So it's really interesting because people seem to be saying, including the academic, maybe it's time for this English version to not be held up. When they talk about, you're talking about mis and disinformation with climate change, how often the climate change deniers say, well, let's have a debate trying to represent that if we have one person, you have one person, they can sell it as it's 50-50 in the world, but really it's like 99-1. So how do you represent that? And I guess what they're saying, what I hear them saying is that this is not an even 50-50 on these two things. It's not even. But I'm interested in your thoughts around the protest and around the actions of the protest and where you sit on it.
Yeah. So when I first heard that there had been a protest like this and had damaged the treaty, I thought, oh no, because I thought the actual document had been damaged, and I thought if it had been like a just stop oil thing, probably a bit of a step too far. I think it's a bit different than damaging an artwork. But then, of course, I read about what it actually was, and this is not damaging the historical document. It's damaging a museum display, and not necessarily something I would participate in. But if you want to look at how effective the protest was, I think they really did get across the point they were trying to make. That whole news story, and I watched that earlier on One News. That story wouldn't have been on the news had this protest not happened. They wouldn't have been getting that opinion from the academic and so on.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps a lot of people in this country are unaware that in international law, when you've got a treaty like this, it is the one in the Indigenous language that is always used in a legal sense. And and as the protest group was saying, and as others in that piece were saying, it can be a bit misleading to have a next to it this English version, which is not an English translation of the Indigenous language. It's a separate document with different meaning. And I think the curator from Te Papa who spoke, I think gave a good balanced response, and I think for a lot of people going to that exhibition, maybe if they'd read the other things there in the museum, they'd be aware of these differences, but perhaps not, and perhaps people going to the museum wouldn't read all the signs there. They might just read the two documents there, and particularly if there's someone from overseas, they're only going to understand the English one. So
right. But I think what they did say, I haven't been to Te Papa for a decade or so, a bit less than that. But what they're saying is on those podiums, it explains the differences. But like you're saying, it kind of also makes me think about, those debates that were happening, especially around America, about taking down statues of slave owners and they should be taken down and got rid of. I always thought personally that the best thing to happen with those is they should actually be put somewhere, like in a museum, and then it should be written as to who they were and what they did, as opposed to just deleting them, because you can't delete them from history. So I wonder if there would be a middle ground here, whereas they would make it more obvious to the differences. It's not just like on a machine you have to push the button of as you're walking past, but say this is this and this is why there's disagreement. Because for people to give context to this, and this is how I always explain it from a layman's point of view, if I made a contractual agreement with a French speaker, and there was two contracts, there was the French contract and there was the English contract, then I'm only signing on board to the English contract because I don't speak French, which means Māori only signed on to the Māori side of it because they didn't speak English, which is why, especially in the UN and stuff, when they go into Indigenous rights, they always go back to the Indigenous language to make their rulings from. Ironically, which we're going to talk about a bit later on when it comes to Moana Tūwhare and Ngāpuhi as well. I was going to play one more clip. This is actually from the TV3 news. They had a slightly different take on one part of it. Let me play it for people.
Those who weren't taken away were still protesting outside the museum.
Hang up some official...
And mostly the reason we're playing this is because of the shirt he's wearing. One of the protesters in some BHN drip there. If the left vote, the left wins. So we had to give credit to at least the other side channel as well.
Of Te Treaty, so our people know, all of our people.
The group remains defiant and wants Te Papa to keep the changes they made.
Well, I think we can all agree that Te Papa will not be doing that. They won't be keeping the changes. But yeah, it's interesting, eh? I'm often think about protest and where is the line, if there is a line. You're completely right that if this hadn't have happened, that academic wouldn't have been on news tonight talking about this issue. I'm still personally uncomfortable with damage, especially to something that's in a museum that's been there for a long time. But in saying all of that, I mean, you could say that 1981, the Springboks tour had violence, and that's how they got their end at the end. And most people would look back on 81 now, see it as a successful protest. Yet there was violence and there was cancelling of rugby games and all sorts of stuff. So probably history is the thing that will paint this as a revolutionary good thing or an overreach in a minute. Maybe we can't quite see that today.
And I would like to see that Te Papa exhibition, now include the, this part of the history as well, include the protests, include the photographs of that there, have that in one of the displays, because I think that's that's part of that history that they are showing in the museum now.
Yeah,
maybe a
I
bit
think
meta, but it, it is. It's because it's been a long time since I've been to that exhibition, but it is not just about what this historical document is, but about the different interpretations over time and the debates around it and things. So I think add that to the exhibition now. It's become a part of that history.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe there'd be again. I'm not trying to play both sides and looking for the middle ground, but at the very least, if they fix it and put it back, there could be something in there which is a photographic journal of what happened, why then, and why it was done. And that because look, they talk about the treaty being a living document. This is a part of the life of the treaty right now. What we're talking about.